All right, we're going to go ahead and turn the mic on. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to have some people filtering in because these rooms in the back, first day, first session, nobody knows where they're going, so it's easy to get lost. Come on in, fill in. So thank you so much for picking this session. I know there's a lot of great tracks, a lot of great topics, so I really appreciate you all coming out. And I want to do everything I can to make sure that you get the most out of this. So, if there's something you don't understand, please let me know. So a little background. I was a BA before I knew what a BA was. It's my life, my passion, and no matter what roles I've had, I've brought those strengths to it. And so as a BA, I thought, I'm capturing requirements, some basic requirements, maybe about security, about login, about session management. Sometimes I was doing access control models. But until I managed a delivery organization that was actually delivering the software and systems used by our technology, risk, and compliance and security teams, I didn't realize how little I knew. So that kind of gave me the idea is, really as BAs, we need to be on the forefront of security, risk, fraud, building these into our systems because the days of being able to get away with errors are gone. And if you don't believe me, I will almost promise you every one of your companies, every company you've been with has been hacked. Maybe they didn't get anything of value, but you've been hacked. It's inevitable. So let me kick off, and unfortunately I got to start with a few disclaimers just based on the nature of the content. So the slides that I have rotating here, the ones that are in the back of the handouts that you've got on the seats, are all from the Verizon 2015 security report. Amazing thing, I've got a link to it. From my website or from the Rising Media conference site, you'll be able to download a copy of this. It's got a link to the report. It's fascinating, it's written in English, so there are things you might have to Google to see what they mean. I did, but a lot of them, it really is written in pure English that everybody can understand. I am solely responsible for all content in this presentation. Absolutely none of this information is supported or endorsed by my current employer, and it does not represent any of their policies, procedures, or any information. This is a general presentation giving you kind of the highlights of the security landscape that would apply to BAs. So this is all general information. Also, I put the information together so I have a good feeling for most of this stuff. So please ask questions, participate. I know this information. I'm trying to share with you, so please stop me and ask questions, and then I'll be available afterwards as well. Also, absolutely no animals were harmed during the creation of this presentation, but please support your local pet rescue groups. I want to start off with a short video. So that was provided, that was a video done by a bank trying to get their customers to focus in on the need for security, but it really underlines all the things we take for granted. We don't realize how exposed we are, and that by the time a system is out there, by the time we put a process in place, it's too late to make some of the changes that need to happen. And you never want to do this retroactively. So why do we care? Why would we care as BAs? Because really, we're the first line. We're the first opportunity to catch this stuff. Even if, how many groups here, just show of hands, have a security group that oversees their projects and requirements? Okay, a good number. How about a records retention group? Fraud management? Risk management? Okay, so a smattering of hands. How many of those people attend every one of your requirements gathering sessions with the business and your stakeholders? Okay, do they ever?
Yes.
Okay, or do you provide checkpoints with them along the way to see and make sure that things... Okay, and that's how a lot of groups do, is they provide checkpoints. But what you're in essence doing is you're inadvertently throwing requirements over the wall to them and hoping what they throw back will work. You're also relying that the person you're working with knows enough about the domain and the application and the system and the processes to know what to look for. But you're the advocate. You are the advocate for the business, for the system. You're the only one who really sees the end-to-end picture. That needs to be true for security, risk, and fraud as well. Because those are stakeholders. Those are business drivers, business needs that need to be taken into account as well. So let's take a look at just a few of our infamous top 10 from the Tom's Top 10 Guides. These are the top 10 current breaches that have been discovered so far, and the number of records that have been exposed so far. And Sony gets an honorable mention because not only did they lose records, but the information was used to completely blackmail them into moving movies, affecting their decisions. I mean, they were pretty much held hostage, and there wasn't anything they could do about it. All this information is in the handouts that you've got. If you sat in the back of the room, as punishment, you have to come up and get one at the end of the show. So, or you can move to an earlier seat. So, we all heard about Target. Anyone not hear about Target? Okay, so this one was in the news and famous, and everyone said, hey, we had Black Friday, credit cards were stolen. But that was such a small piece of the story. I want to use this to illustrate that even though you think your system is safe, it may not be. So the first thing was, it ran for almost a month before they were able to shut it down, before they discovered it and shut it down. The same type of breach, not the same method of getting in, but the same type of getting cards was used at Home Depot, and was over a year before the FBI notified Home Depot that their breach was active. And so this is, again, off of published news that I'm going in, so if you're from Home Depot, I apologize, it's in the news. So how did this happen? Well, first, it started with a phishing scam. So a phishing scam is when someone sends a fake email. It can also be done over the phone or other methods, but trying to convince you that they need your logins, your credentials, background information for legitimate purposes. So this was sent to a company that Target does business with. The company that controls their HVAC, their heating and air systems, is how they got penetrated. So think about that. I've never, ever considered an HVAC vendor as part of my requirements because I've never dealt with them. But this is how the breach started. So on their systems, they fell victim to a phishing scheme. And instead of having active virus scanning, because the virus they got hit with was a pretty common one, they did weekly and monthly scans. So by the time they discovered and ran antivirus and cleaned it, their credentials, and their login credentials, their information had already been compromised. And one of the things that the hackers were able to get was the login information that they used to access Ariba. Ariba is a supplier and purchase order management system. It does more than that. But basically, if you want to get paid, you post an invoice to Ariba, Target looks at it, they approve it, and then they pay it. So they use the login for that HVAC company to access through Ariba. Ariba uses Active Directory. So how many people use LDAP, Active Directory, or some common directory? Okay, So someone else's system, now compromised by credentials, allowed them to use those credentials to now start logging into Windows servers that had known vulnerabilities. And those known vulnerabilities allowed them to install Trojan.postram, which actually, so as you swipe a credit card, you're like, okay, if I swipe a credit card, the transaction clears, it's an encrypted transaction, and then it's stored encrypted. I don't even store the credit card number on my systems. I should be safe. This actually scans in RAM. So the active memory on the servers, the card hasn't been encrypted yet. So on a scheduled basis, they scraped the RAM of the machine, packaged it, and then sent it out, and Target didn't even see when the traffic was leaving their system. The cost to date has been $252 million between changes, compliance, not counting lost business, and the fact that Target is going to end up, has settled with a lot of the credit card companies and banks because they're going to assume liability for a lot of the charges. So as you see, there's no straight attacks anymore. It's not just banging away at usernames and passwords, getting into a system and stealing data. These are very complex, multi-threaded, multi-connected attacks that we have to defend against. Now, a lot of that's going to get way below where we ever have to be, but I wanted to kind of use that to illustrate as we're talking about some of the things that you'd want to be aware of. So, what happens when you don't take action? And I wanted to highlight a few things. All of these facts are in the back. 80% of your breaches are external, 20% are internal. And that's held pretty steady. That, over the last decade that Verizon's been doing this report, that hasn't changed. 23% of recipients open phishing messages and 11% click through. And half of all phishing messages are clicked within the first hour. By the time you see that you're getting phished, it's too late. Half of the people have already clicked or opened and already infected your system. So when the industry finds a vulnerability, they publish it. There's a lot of different forums. Almost 99.9% of those vulnerabilities still work a year after they've been published. That would be like saying, I got a cold that didn't go away, and I've now waited a year and I still haven't gone to the doctor. We would never do that with our health. Why are we doing that with our system health? There's a question, we'll hit it a little bit. Should we be worried about mobile devices? Right now, the answer is no. 0.03% of mobile devices in the world have been compromised by malware. So extremely low. However, the same methods of logging in through mobile, logging in through web, logging in through direct access will apply, because those are access issues we're going to talk about. How much is it going to cost? Think about how many people have a system with less than 1,000 records? Okay, one person. Anywhere from $50,000 to $87,000 is their estimated cost for a loss of 1,000 records. Does your system have 10, 100 times as many? Multiply that out. So if you've got a system that's dealing with 100,000 records, you're talking about potentially $500,000 to almost $1 million worth of cost just for the loss of those. Also, 55% of internal abuse was due to privileged access. We're going to talk more about that, which means people had access to systems and abused that access to get access to data, or they created errors. They accidentally. So 30% of the time, we accidentally send information to the wrong people. Imagine you set up test cases using customer logins or account numbers, because some of our systems you have to use real data to log in. 30% of the time, we're sending that to the wrong people, internal or external. 17%, we're publishing non-public data to public web servers. Information that should not be accessible, which means maybe the server was accessible or the system was. And 12%, we're just not disposing of records properly. So a lot of that's not as applicable to what we're concerned with here. But let's first look at the context. So the first thing is, when we're talking about a system, we've basically got several tiers. The first thing is, we need to keep everybody out. So that would be when we'd have 100% secure systems if nobody ever had to use them. So the first thing we do is, you've got to have some lock on the door. But then you have to have a way for people to unlock the door and get into your systems. So you have to allow authorized access. Next, once somebody is in the system, you've got to control and monitor exactly what they're doing. And you've got to detect the changes that are occurring so that you can decide whether or not they're bad or not. And that's often, as BAs, we're stopping right here. We're stopping with the access model and not considering what happens after the fact. And then once we detect something, we have to have a process for resolving issues. How many people have use cases, user stories, policies or procedures in your system documentation for what to do when something doesn't go the way it's supposed to, when something goes wrong? Few people. Awesome. You guys need to tell everybody else and spread that around. We need more people doing that. Because it's not easy, and we never have enough time. We're always under deadlines. PMs have no clue how much work it takes, and they always crunch us into their timeline, but this is really important. So there's 5 key areas at a high level again that we're going to kind of take a look at. The first is called identity access management. This is the area which really controls who is the identity. What is the identity in your system that a user maps to? What access are they allowed to have? And how do you manage that access to ensure they're only doing what they do? Records management. A record is anything that has material value. So the color of a button isn't really a record. We don't care. A status color could be. A transaction could be. A name, an address, an account number. All of these things are records. A form that somebody fills out could be treated as a record. So a record is anything you need to actively manage. Fraud. What happens when you detect activity that is unintended, is not what you want? And then a lot of times we really don't have to worry, unless we're on an infrastructure project, about physical security or network security. I'm going to talk a little bit about physical security in terms of records management later on, if you do have paper records you're managing. But for the most part, we're going to leave those alone because there's nothing we can do about them. Either our network and infrastructure teams are doing their job or not, or we're not really going to get to the level where our requirements define them. So in IAM, Identity Access Management, first you have users. So a user is going to be a human being. You could also look at this in terms of entities like a system. You could treat a system the same as a user if you have system-to-system connectivity. You need to map that user to an identity. That identity is a profile, something that you're using to track and manage and control access to. So based on my identity, that determines what I have access to. And once I have access to something, I have permissions controlling what I can and cannot do. So when we talk about identity, this is called coarse-grained entitlements. There's 2 terms, coarse-grained and fine-grained. Coarse-grained entitlements is simply, how do I identify? How do I know that I'm who I say I am and whether or not I should be able to get in through the first door? So all that is mapping users or systems to the identity that you're then going to manage. And the normal way we do, there's 2 normal ways that you can do that authentication. Challenge response is what we're most familiar with, and that is typically username, password. Some sort of a challenge or question and answer where there's a combination or a feedback that the system looks and recognizes and then knows you're there. If you've enabled auto login, the cookie is doing that for you. It's saying, hey, this is Bob, and Bob already has permission to get into the system. On the next slide, we're going to talk in detail more about adaptive authentication, which is a risk-based approach to authentication based on fine-grained entitlements. So with access, fine-grained entitlements is all the things I can do once I'm in a system. How many people have built like an access control model or a permissions model into their requirements? Where you're talking about, good, everybody probably has at some point, which says, this user will have these permissions and be able to do. It may be a role model, roles in actors. A sure way to see if you've got everything covered, look at your actors, look at your users, look at your security model, and if everything doesn't map up perfectly, everything relates, you've missed something. You've got a problem. If you have an entity that is mapping to multiple areas, you probably haven't decomposed it far enough and you've potentially created a vulnerability. So when we talk about these fine-grained entitlements, then we also have to figure out where are we going to manage them. And there's 2 places. We could have a centralized storage. So if you think about an AD, LDAP, a central repository for accounts, is a repository for course grade entitlements. It's nice and easy because everything's in one place. All I have to do is connect and manage there, and it works. Well, you can do the same thing for fine grade entitlements, which means across all of your applications, either for your customers or your internal employees or teammates or vendors, you can manage all of those permissions, all of those settings in one centralized place, which gives you the ability to manage, control, turn things on and off from a centralized location. Has some advantages. Or you can distribute it to the applications that you're building. If you're buying and customizing applications, then a lot of people want to use the security model that's built in because it tends to be a lot more robust than you would have if you actually had to rebuild that separately. So there's no right answers. And in a lot of organizations, you're going to have a hybrid of the two. Some applications, especially if it's secure information, are going to use their own security model. Others, you may want to have a centralized approach. So when we talk about adaptive authentication, we're talking about a risk-based model. So if you think about it, think about your credit cards, because we take this kind of for granted. Every time you swipe a card, there is an extremely rich BI system on the back end determining whether or not that charge should go through, based on your spending habits, based on transactions. If you want to get your card frozen, try this. Swipe your card at the gas station and pump $2 to $3 worth of gas. Then go make a large electronics purchase. It will not go through. Why? Because we've known that people who steal credit cards swipe at a gas pump because there's no cameras and it's very easy. They run a charge for a small amount just to see that it goes through. Then they quickly go and they start making large purchases. It's a safe way of testing a card and not being inside a store. Well, that'll also stop us if we accidentally top off our gas and then try and make a purchase. So as you get more and more risk based on location, you may want to have step-up authentication, which is the more risky the behavior is undoing, the more authentication, the more protection. So for example, if somebody wants to see an overview of their account or an overview of their system, an overview of purchase orders, seeing that information is pretty safe, so maybe it's really easy to see. But if I want to change an address, maybe that's a little more risky. If I want to send a purchase, if I want to send an invoice, if I want to send a payment, do a transfer, delete records, you're increasing the risk, therefore you want to increase the security. And you think, how many people here consider address a very risky piece of data in their systems? A little less than half. I never really did. It was kind of one of those things that, it's important. It's very valid, and for some of our systems, especially if you're dealing with privileged information, you want to make sure you get it right. But one of the most common methods of internal theft is called address changeback. I go into a purchase system, I change somebody's address to my own or to a mailbox, I issue a payment to that address, and I change it back. Because most systems aren't smart enough to detect that. And so now I get the check delivered, I can go and cash that, and nobody knows how it happened. I go in as a customer and go, well, I didn't get my payment. The address is there. The company's going to send a new check. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this, and these are areas where you can work with your security and fraud teams, and it's a lot of fun if you want to look at introducing some of these into your area. IP blocking. If you do a lot of business in geographical areas, it's very easy to restrict through geolocation or IP blocking where you do business. If you do not do foreign transactions, there's no reason why you shouldn't be blocking everything from a foreign IP unless potentially you have customers or employees who travel abroad. Trusted device. Some of us may have done this where we get a key to make sure that the cell phone that we've entered into the system is valid or a device is valid, so we now trust that device, which means it's secure. But if you're sending that code to the same device that might be compromised and the same device that somebody's trying to access the system through, it's not helping you. Because they already have the device, they're already getting in through mobile, so sending a mobile passcode isn't going to save you. Biometric are really cool. Fingerprints, facial, those are getting better so that it's working more and less annoying. The way you shake, so if people are getting into mobile device, there's a company that has a shake-based technology. So if I want to get into an application, I can shake it, and how I shake is unique, and that will let me get in. But this is an example for step-up authentication. If I want to make changes, if I want to post, If I want to view confidential information, probably you want to reprompt them with another method. We've all probably seen the hard and soft tokens and use those. Those are a great method. Sending temporary keys, again, make sure you're not sending the key to the compromised device. User-defined factors. This is a way of preventing phishing by allowing the user to customize their interface, put up a picture, put up some welcome saying they know that it's your system and not a fake phishing site. And CAPTCHA is basically a way of locking down your system so that it's a human being who is actually accessing, not something else. So the other area is, does anyone here use a third-party identity to allow access to your systems? A Google account, Apple account, Facebook, LinkedIn. If you loaded the app for the conference, you could log in through Facebook, you could log in through LinkedIn, or you could set up your own. Someone I talked to in this area basically said, I don't care about coarse-grained entitlements. I don't care about third-party identities. If Google or Apple has verified that that is the person, that's good enough for me. But the minute they try and do something, I'm going to make sure that I'm stepping up the authentication and I'm requiring additional information that's unique to them. So you don't necessarily even have to manage the identity yourself. There's an advantage, but then you have to have a risk model and an authentication model built into the back end of that. So one of the biggest challenges, and this can bring organizations to a grinding halt, is when you build, think about your teammate systems and how many different systems you use internally. Or if you've got different client systems, they all sprouted up with unique needs. And then somebody gets the bright idea of pulling them together in one portal or with a single login. And then all of a sudden you have one of the worst things you ever have to deal with, which is mapping identities. How do I know which Doug is the Doug that I want? If I have an account that allows two different people to log in and access it, how do I know that what Doug is allowed to do versus what Ann is allowed to do, or should they be part of that profile? This can drive organizations crazy. But if you have a solid model for managing identities from the beginning, if you're working with your teams, it will save you hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars down the road trying to build systems that tie things together. And again, as I'm going through this, my apologies, some of this is going to be really deep information, some of it's going to be old hat to some of you, some of it's going to be new. Please stop me as we're going through, and we can discuss it. Also, I'll leave time for questions at the end as the fog lifts. So, passwords are obsolete, but we continue to use them and probably will for a while. So one of the big problems we have is password reuse. I'm not going to ask how many of you reuse your passwords, but a lot of our people, a lot of our teammates do that. Especially if you create rotating passwords, the more complicated your passwords, the more times you require a teammate to change them, the more likely they are to write it down on their desk. So are you creating a bad behavior accidentally trying to be more secure? So the reason this is a problem is, if a system outside your control, like the HVAC, gets compromised, you've lost control of your username and password. Somebody can get in, and you have no way of knowing who those are. So take a look at the top 25 passwords for last year. These are the top passwords. People are actually using these. I hope nobody here. If you are, I will expect to see you very busily starting to change passwords during the presentation. The one that I thought was really funny was number 13, let me in. That was pretty cool. These vary every single year, but the data seems to be pretty reliable. Shadow, the most common dog name in the world, also is the most common password. So if you're using your pet names, use the pet names as a combination or something else, not just I'm Fluffy. Because then you'll get hacked because you're posting pictures of Fluffy and it's not hard to figure it out. Your kids' names, kids' birthdays, all that are very common. And again, for anything that's not out of the Verizon report, at the bottom of each slide is the source, so you can read the rest of the article about this. So let's talk a little bit about entitlement requirements. So when you're working on coarse and fine-grained entitlements, this is where you really need to put in your focus as a BA. Put a lot of attention in, put a lot of time, force the PMs to give you the time in the schedule, or do it anyway and just say, hey, I stuck to my timeline. What can the user actually view, modify, and delete is very important. Understanding the system well enough. Meet with your developers and make sure you understand how these systems work so that you can write requirements that fit in. If you're buying a system that has a model, start with that model. Don't start with your requirements, because then a developer will rip out their part of the code and put in their own custom and then blame you for it, saying, well, they asked for this and the system didn't do it, so that's what I went ahead and did. Look out for embedded or inherited permissions. If you create groups, it's very easy to manage users and groups. This is my end user read-only group, and I have a developer group, and I have an editor group, and I have an approver group, and I have an admin group. What happens if somebody gets added to more than one group? What happens if you decide that all admins are also developers? You might be actually creating a back hole violation that you did not realize by giving somebody access through nested permissions. So map those out. Take test cases. Work with your QA and test teams to create negative test cases. Come up with all the ways to break the system. Put Bob in every group and see what happens. See if you're able to do things. See if your tracking and monitoring works. Or the other mistake we use is we just assume it's going to work, especially when we're buying software. We just say, well, they wouldn't have put the software on the market if it had a hole. I'm just going to use it and it should work fine. But you may not be using it the way they intended. Because if I showed everybody the same picture and asked everybody to describe it, nobody's description will match. It's impossible. We all have different ways, different biases at looking at the world. So you have to make sure that everybody's on the same page with those reviews. So there's two other terms I want to bring in that if you've worked with your security teams, you may have heard. If you've been a manager, you may have had to attest to this in an annual or biannual audit. The first one is called segregation of duties. This means that you have separate roles, and those roles shall not cross where it creates a problem. For example, if a developer can check code into SourceSafe or Harvest or another code management system, and they're also an approver to be able to deploy that code to an environment or to a production environment, they have the ability to insert bad code or malicious code and publish it without any checks. So think about if you have somebody who has edit privileges. Should someone be in an editing group and an approvers group? The answer may be yes, in which case you need to decompose those groups further. Because should I ever be allowed to approve what I've edited? If I can approve what I've edited, then there should be no approval. The minute I edit it should just go live, because having me click, yeah, save, yep, I promise, isn't doing you any good. So instead, decompose those groups and look what you're going for. So your security team will really be able to help. Your QA team is really good at finding broken things and breaking things. So use them to come up with scenarios. Hopefully they won't go too crazy or have too much fun. Yes?
Do you have any recommendations for like smaller teams that have to manage those types of roles?
So for smaller teams, you end up taking shortcuts, but with smaller teams, you're usually dealing with smaller systems and the risk is less, so your due diligence can be less. Reaching out to the VA community, talking in forums and getting best practices, using peer reviews. For some of us, we don't have security teams, so we're on our own. Just come up with the best job you can, really. Find as many different people. Talk to your line of business people. Run through their user stories. Run through their use cases. And also challenge them. Say, okay, if you were going to destroy data, let's say you found out you're getting laid off, and you want to do as much damage as you can to the system, how would you do it? And start closing those loopholes. Now it'll freak people out, because you're like, wait a minute, I'm trying to find out how to break the system. Yeah, I'm trying to find out how to break the system so it can't be broken. Finding out how not to do things can be a great way of doing it. Least privileged access. This, if you can enforce this in your systems, in your organizations, it will save a lot of grief. This means each identity has the absolute minimum amount of permissions needed to do their job. or to complete whatever it is they're trying to do. Nothing more. It is so much easier for us to just say, well, we'll give them a little extra access because it's less work for us, it will reduce our overall cost, but that dramatically increases risk. So if you think about the target breach, if an ID that was only used for Ariba has permission to somehow log into Windows servers, that's certainly not least privileged. They should have, that AD group, that AD access should have been exclusive only to that system, and every other system should have rejected it. And then that wouldn't have been a problem. They would have had to find another way in. They would have, but it would have might have taken longer. So as you're thinking about it, look for what the minimum people need to do, and then if they need to do more, does this mean I need a different group, a different level of permissions? Am I creating risks? And again, back to our stats. 55% of our internal problems are caused by privilege abuse. Number one group that's responsible for that is your system administrators, because they have access to the root system and can bypass all the security you put in your system. If you think about DBAs, a DBA may manage the database on the server, but if they can use their identity to log into a database and see records, they can do anything they want. They can delete records, they can modify them, they can package them and send them outside your organization. And the 40% of the people who did that were financially motivated. 60% usually are done by mistake or error, where I created an export and sent it to the wrong team, wrong group, accidentally posted the information to the wrong area. But 40% of the people that are going to create a privileged abuse are doing so because they either intend to sell the information, or they were receiving some sort of a financial gain for it. So let's talk a little bit about records management. So we talked about identities and users and how important it is to manage what people can do. But it's equally as important of thinking about what it is they're doing it to. And that's where our records come in. You could spend an entire lifetime going crazy on records management. So you want to start at the highest risk areas, the highest risk changes, highest risk transactions, and work your way down as time allows. So when we're talking about a record, what we're concerned with is all the changes that can happen to that record. Any versioning that needs to occur. Transport. How are we moving records? How are we sharing records? How are they going between systems or even within a system? How and where are we storing them? And what are the storage information? And then what are our retention considerations? So diving into that a little deeper, with updates and versioning. The more you can tie versioning and updates to your fine-grained entitlements, the better. Which means anything that can be changed should be tied to a role, a permission, a group, an entitlement that does that change. You should have a mapping that you're managing on both sides. Do you care what's changed? Do you care to log every time somebody accesses the system? Every time somebody refreshes? Do you care if somebody changes their nickname? Maybe, maybe not. That's where you need to decide where the risk is and where it's important. And how will versions be used? Are you going to display versions to somebody? Are they going to be used for historical? Are they used for audit? Is it forensic analysis only? When something goes wrong, you need to show versions? How many people tie versioning and version requirements into their systems? Okay, good number. Some of us don't have a choice, especially if we're working in regulated areas, healthcare, insurance, finance. A lot of that's built in. But versioning is crazy, and I've got some a little more on that. A lot of us falsely rely on encryption and think, okay, we're going to just encrypt it and we'll be good to go. So the first thing is, encryption only works when that encrypted data is outside of your organization or system. If your system can read and decrypt data to be able to use it, your system can be used to decrypt data to read it and export it. So the encryption only helps in that method. The other thing is, you saw the passwords. If those are the 25 most common passwords, and if I download and get a list of usernames and passwords with a standard encryption, all I have to do is start matching the most common encryption keys to the most common passwords, and I can guess which password is which encryption, which means I can tell which encryption method you use, which means I can now decrypt it out of your system to be able to tell those most common passwords. Unless you use a technique called seeding. Seeding means you take data and you either insert additional data and then encrypt it, or you encrypt it and then insert additional data into the stream. That data can be then taken in and out of your system, so unless somebody is actually breaching or using your system to commit fraud, I can't decrypt it. Because if everybody in here used 1234 as their password, the encrypted version of that would look different for each of us. So I'd never be able to tie that apart. So this is where you could add a simple non-functional requirement which says all encrypted data must be seeded. And see what your teams say. They should be able to do it. It's not too complicated. Storage. This one's fun because this is another one where things that we think are within our control go horribly awry. So a lot of us are starting to do a lot more with big data, data analytics. So do you really want to run data analytics off of your production data and bring your system to a crawl? You want to move it to a BI warehouse. Okay, I've now taken data, and if I'm managing fine-grained entitlements within the system, and I now extract that data into a data reporting repository, have I now undermined the security and permissions I've put into place? Most likely I have. So I've got a choice. Do I then have my BI repository call back to my main system to get that data and use its security model to determine what data gets published? Or do I rebuild the entire security model and now maintain the same security model in two places? There's no good answer. There's no happy answer to that. Eventually, teams will be able to, I think there'll be some BI tools that will better address that, but for now, if you've got secure sensitive data, you may only want to export a small portion of it for the BI and actually have no HIPAA, no PCI, no customer identifiable information. Or what you may want to do is create keys so that you take a customer, create a key that can be used for BI reporting, but that cannot be readily mapped back to the host system. That's another technique. Retention. So first, if you have retention guidelines, if you have retention policies, those should be listed as a reference or an appendix in your requirements document, and you should tag everything with those codes, tag those with those policies whenever you can, and make sure they're updated. One of the things that didn't occur to me until I really started getting into this was that records that are stored forever can actually be really bad and really harmful. I'm one who saves everything. And then I discovered a beautiful thing called discovery. When your company gets sued, when there's a problem, all records associated back to the beginning of time are potentially on hold and legal documents that could be used against you. So it's possible for someone to pull stuff out of context in a system that's 20 years old and say that you weren't properly managing security and policies because HIPAA didn't exist 20 years ago. So figure out what the retention is. Versioning, the same thing. What is the maximum retention you want to store versions? We don't have unlimited space, although space is cheap, but what is the advantage versus disadvantage of storing that record? And the other thing, more than anything else, whatever you're doing, do it consistently. Consistently wrong, or a little bit wrong, is actually better than inconsistent. Because inconsistent means there's more chance for errors, more chance for mistakes. It also means it's more chance for liability. If you can't say that you're doing the same thing across one system or across multiple systems, really it's going to show the organization may not be protecting data the way they should. So let's jump over to fraud. So we talked about locking people in and controlling what they do. We talked a little bit about the storage and the management of the data, the records when they're doing. What happens when we discover something's wrong? So the first thing is, the only way we know that fraud exists is it's always based on a change. Fraud isn't built in. You know, there's not a button we built in when we launch our system that says every 5 days, push all customer information to the web and see how much money we can make off of it. I hope. If so, reconsider your career. So the minute a change happens, there's got to be something that triggers awareness. Is it somebody looking at a report? Is it system monitoring? Are you using a fraud analytics? Does anybody here use a dedicated fraud analytics package? Wow, that catches me by surprise. Is there anyone here in financial services? Okay, you're using fraud analytics systems. You may just not know it. I don't know about insurance and some of the other areas, but those are running on the back end and they're amazing. So if you want to do a little fun research, look at some of the products, watch their videos, what you can do with it, even tying in social presence and social media into your fraud analytics is amazing. Anyway, off topic. So once I discover a change, once I have awareness, what am I going to do with it? So I have to decide and take an action. First, validate, is it something that's good or bad? Is it something that exceeds my risk tolerance? You don't want people chasing ghosts. I mean, if you're parents, think about how many times the kids do something you don't want them to do, but you're not enforcing every little thing. It would drive you crazy. You pick the things that matter, that are going to get them hurt, you hurt, or something you care about destroyed. So then you've got to decide what's the action I'm going to take to resolve that, and then what's the resolution. Hopefully that resolution feeds back into your requirements so that you can plug that hole in whatever your next sprint, iteration, or release is. So your system, in order to work with fraud, needs to encompass 5 areas. If you're using a fraud system, then meet with the fraud and the analytics team, determine if they need your data and how to work with it. If not, this may be something that you have to build into your system. Look for in the system that's part of an RFP or that you're buying, or something that's part of your business processes. And this is internal systems as well. 20% of your loss is going to come from internal mistakes, errors, or theft. Data loss. One of the big things that hit Sony that was so painful was the hackers went in and deleted servers and deleted data, and they lost records. How do you get that back? Could they go to backups? What happens if the backups get wiped out? Data correlation. The data in your system has meaning related to other pieces of data. Is that data being used properly? Because if you miscorrelate data, you can create false positives. So you need to know what the data means to each other. So if you're doing data diagrams, your data modeling, that will be a way of really defining your data correlation and then can feed into your fraud analytics. Data integrity. How do you know that the data you're seeing is valid? How many people here have to worry about SOX compliance or have SOX in their organization? Okay, not as many as I would have expected. You cannot certify to your end of your SOX if you cannot maintain that the integrity of your data is correct. Any one system could cause you to fail SOX, and ask your investment team what that would do to your stock price if you failed SOX 1 year. And could not say that your earnings were actually accurate, even if they are. System access, what is part of it? What does your system access? What are all the pieces to it? What are other systems that it relates to? What happens, like at Target, if one of those systems is breached? What exposure does that have to potentially your system? And then activity monitoring. Again, you've got to discover a change to be able to know whether or not it's bad or not. Because, think about it. Almost every change we're going to see on a daily basis is okay. Our systems are designed to manage data changes, or else we wouldn't have them. We do it manually. So we've got about 10 minutes that I want to open up for discussions. So part of this is, at a conference, you're going to learn a bit in the sessions. It's going to be a little overwhelming. It's going to glaze over. You'll download later and remember some of it. But one of the most valuable things you're going to do is make connections. Make connections with the speakers, make connections with each other. Find people that you can then go out to, ask questions. Find the sites and the tools they're using to continue these discussions. Like the IIBA website is great, and your chapter website is a great place to continue these discussions. So get connected. I'm excited about this because I only get to see people, even that I'm in the same city with, at conferences like this. So it's a great chance to connect and learn new things from them. So please stay connected. So I want to open up, we can close out. So I've got some additional handouts for anyone that didn't get it at the front and business cards. Feel free to connect with me. So I want to take kind of last 10 minutes and open up to questions, specifics, things where you're like, wow, okay, my brain's bleeding. Yes?
Question on bank routing numbers. You're not
Yes.
because they have to be validated and run through an algorithm validated to the routing number. I know they use production routing numbers in our tests. They make up the bank name, they make up the account number. I keep wondering how big of a hole that is.
Okay, so if you're financial systems, bank routing numbers have to be validated because you can't create a fake routing number or it'll fail in the system, so you have to use production data. A lot of financial systems, medical, the relationships of the data are so complex that all testing is done with customer data. It's horrible. If you can build a system or a way of translating data and maintaining that data integrity, it's awesome. If not, it's risk. Routing numbers are published on every single check, and they are unique to each bank. They're low risk. Routing number and full checking account number greatly increases your risk. So if you can only obfuscate or scramble or seed the account number, you're automatically reducing the rate, even if it's predictable. Control the access to the data during testing. Make sure that only authorized people have access to it. Make sure they're not emailing it around. Make sure that they're accessing it from a certain information. Use software that can do that testing for you. If you can load that account information or pull it and then have a system execute those test cases, it's one more step to help protect those records. Unless your testing system has been compromised, but you know, we would never sleep if we worried about everything. That's why I got out of security.
But, and what, I want to jump on that. Routing numbers are actually publicly available. Like you can look up any bank's routing number. So also be careful about what you're trying to protect. Like it's okay to use public routing numbers because you can Google it right now and you can find the list of any bank's routing numbers.
Yep, so Andrew made a great point there. If the data is publicly available or easily accessible, it probably falls much lower on your risk and doesn't need to be managed. Yes, ma'am?
I was going to add on to that. Knowing your organization and the other Nasha, for example, where PCI does not have the requirement of taking that user actually in the test environment, whereas PCI does. You're not able to use actually in the test environment.
Yep.
Read through those requirements to better understand what you need to do with the system. Also, like one more thing to say about access, I would argue that access has everything to do with networking. So when I saw that we were talking about that, I think there was more focus on in terms of file security is network segmentation.
Okay, so the second part of the question was, why did we discuss networking? Because networking and access go hand in hand, and physically separating networks or systems to reduce risk. Is that? That's a great point. So the reason I didn't mention that, other than I really didn't think I'd get through all the slides on time, even talking too fast, was so a lot of us have networking and infrastructure groups. So if we've defined the requirements, the risk of the information, the system interconnectivity, the networking design team should, as part of their processes, deciding, should I put this in the DMZ? Should I physically separate these? Which ones are okay to be co-located on servers? Which ones can be on VMware, or VMs, and other things? So I think in some cases designing the requirements that can lead to those discussions are very important. The actual design of it is going to come to the people we work with. So it's the network engineers, it's going to be our developers who are doing the actual system design. So unless you're a systems analyst in at that level, I think most BAs just aren't ever going to get to that level. So that was kind of why I had to hit on. We could be here, I could spend all week and talking about these things. So trying to pick that fine line without people just walking into the doors and walls afterwards was a little bit of a challenge, to be honest. So also on that point, and I hit a question over here, please grab my card. So this is one of the newer presentations I've given. It is a complicated topic and there's a million different ways to present it. If you have any thoughts on what worked, what you liked, different ways of doing that, please shoot me an email and let me know. I really want to improve this as I give this more often. I appreciate you being here through the dry run and hope it wasn't noticeable. And I hope you had fun with it, but this is pretty complicated, so any thoughts you have, please poke me in the hall and let me know. Someone had a hand. Yes?
So our organization is dealing more and more with, we are not a development or a healthcare system. We purchase systems.
Yep.
More and more of those are in the cloud.
Yep.
And the data is stored in the cloud. And what we're learning as we're moving through that, the RFP process and our business partners, walking with them through how we select the right system is we have to push really hard on the vendors to identify where the data is going to be stored and what kind of data repositories they have, what they call data warehouses.
Yep.
So we've actually developed a really kind of a deep questionnaire that we're forcing the vendors to respond to before they need to come to the door. And some of them are pushing back a little bit, which
Yep.
is surprising, but even if they answer all of our questions, how do we validate that what they're telling us is true? Is data at rest encrypted? They're saying yes. So I guess that's one of the challenges with security that we're looking at. We have many systems in-house, and we're comfortable with those because our security is really high, because we're a healthcare system. It's the cloud vendors, it's the ones that are out there in the ether that we don't have as much control over. At least we're perceiving that we don't,
So let me recap. So a lot of us, especially in industries, we realize that software development isn't core to our business. So anytime you can buy a system or go with a cloud service, it may be advantageous. Absolutely, and for organizations, that's probably the right way to go because you've got a dedicated company with many customers that are vetting that system. So by nature, I tend to trust those larger established systems more than I would internal and homegrown. And there's a huge fear. I've seen a huge fear over cloud. Cloud, off-prem, on-prem, okay, so what? There's a fear of cloud because you're having to give up control. Is it any different than if you plug that system into your own network? Other than the fact that you're relying on potentially a different network connectivity instead of between data centers, between offices, you're now going to someone else's data center. But, your servers aren't even in your building. They're in the data center. They may be sitting right next to the same servers. If you're using something like Amazon Cloud, it's very likely that that same data is running in the same room with the same other stuff. So the fear of cloud, I think, is just, it's a fear of giving up control. So the same scrutiny that you have to do internally needs to be applied externally. Working with sourcing, you can put in terms that limit your liability, because if you really want to scare a company, say, okay, you don't want us to inspect, you don't want to reveal that data, that's fine. Here is your liability should you be breached. It will be $10,000 per record, will be the cost of a breach, plus any hard cost that can be documented above and beyond $10,000 per record. Whatever you happen to be. You may find the vendors who are or are not willing to work with you, but I think you'll end up narrowing your scope and finding the ones who are stable. You can also look for or say your system has to pass a third-party audit. Whether you pay for it or whether they do, bring a third party in and say, hey, don't trust us. I'm going to hire this security firm. They're going to do an audit of your systems and your security risk, and it must meet whatever their threshold.
Yeah, and to that point with PCI, most vendors that you work with, they have to hire an external vendor to audit their systems.
Realistically, between PCI, between HIPAA, between SOX and others, a lot of these big vendors are just going to go, they're going ahead and they're doing security audits, they're doing compliance audits, they're publishing that information with third parties because it's limiting their liability. Okay, so what I'm going to do is first, thank you so much for coming out. I hope this has been beneficial. If anybody did not at least take away one valuable piece of information that they can bring back to their organization, please let me know in the back of the room or the hall, and I will make it up to you. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I hope you've got a great time at BBC this year, and thank you so much for coming.